The day my husband was buried, I had exactly $43 in my checking account. I didn't tell anyone that. Not my sister, not the ladies from church who brought over casseroles I couldn't eat, not even my daughter who flew in from Portland and kept asking if I was doing okay financially. I told her I was fine. I'd been saying I was fine for so long it had started to feel like a second name. His name was Harold. We were married 31 years. He was the kind of man who fixed things without being asked. Leaky faucets, loose cabinet hinges, the way I felt on bad days. When he died of a heart attack in the driveway one October morning, I didn't just lose a husband. I lost the whole architecture of my life. The life insurance was smaller than we'd thought. Turns out Harold had let the policy lapse 2 years prior and opened a smaller one without telling me. I found out at the kitchen table with a man in a gray suit who kept offering me water. The payout barely covered the funeral and 3 months of bills. After that, I was on my own. I was 62 years old. I hadn't worked a real job in over a decade. My knees hurt in the mornings. I cried in the shower so my daughter wouldn't hear me over the phone. But I got up. That's the part nobody tells you. Grief doesn't excuse you from the electricity bill. So I got up, updated a resume that looked like a museum artifact, and applied for every position I was remotely qualified for within bus distance of my apartment. The apartment was new too. I'd sold the house in November, couldn't keep up the mortgage alone, and the place was too full of Harold anyway. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his coffee mug still in the drying rack. I moved into a 2-bedroom unit in a quiet building on the edge of downtown, close enough to the grocery store that I could walk when the weather was decent. I got a job in February, bookkeeping assistant at a small property management company called Aldercroft Partners. It wasn't glamorous, filing, data entry, helping reconcile accounts, but it paid enough to cover rent and keep the heat on, and the office was 4 stops on the bus from my apartment. I wore my good blazer on the first day and pretended I wasn't terrified. That's when I started seeing him. There was a man who sat outside the public library, 2 blocks from the bus stop where I got off every morning. He had a folding canvas chair, the kind people bring to outdoor concerts, and he always had it positioned just right to catch the morning sun. He wore a heavy coat regardless of the weather and kept a paper coffee cup near his feet. Mostly he just sat. Sometimes he read a paperback. Sometimes he looked out at the street like he was waiting for something he'd been waiting a long time for. The first morning I walked past him, I didn't stop. I felt guilty about that the rest of the day. The second morning, I dropped $2 in his cup without breaking stride. He looked up and said, "Thank you, ma'am," in a voice so clear and unhurried it surprised me. Not what I expected, though I'm embarrassed now to admit I'd expected anything in particular. I said, "Of course," and kept walking. After that, it became a routine. Every weekday morning, I'd stop at the corner before the library, take $2 or $3 from the small coin purse I started keeping in my coat pocket, specifically for this, and drop it in his cup. We started nodding to each other, then exchanging a few words about the weather. By March, I knew his name was August, like the month, he told me, and he knew I worked nearby and had recently moved to the neighborhood. I didn't know much else about him and didn't feel it was my place to ask. Work was fine, mostly. The office had 6 people, my supervisor, a woman named Joanne who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had a laugh you could hear from the parking lot. 2 property managers who were always either in meetings or on the phone, a young man in IT who came in twice a week, and the new bookkeeper, who had started about a month before me. His name was Fletcher. He was in his mid-30s, well-dressed in the way that looks effortless but isn't, with reddish-brown hair and the kind of easy confidence that makes people assume competence. He was good at his job on the surface, organized, fast, never seemed flustered. The clients liked him. Joanne said he'd been a real find. I had no reason to distrust him. I want to be clear about that. It was nothing he did or said in those early months. It was more of a feeling I couldn't locate, the way you sometimes sense a smell before you can name it. I kept that feeling to myself. I was the new one. I was old enough to be his mother, The last thing I needed was to make trouble over a hunch. Spring came slow that year. April was still cold, and I started bringing 2 cups of coffee from the cart near the bus stop. One for me, one for August. He always accepted it the same way, both hands, a nod, like it was a small ceremony. We talked more. He asked about my work without prying, and I found myself telling him things I hadn't said out loud. That I was still learning the systems, that I felt out of place sometimes, that the job felt like wearing someone else's shoes. He listened the way very few people listen, without preparing his response while you were still talking. One morning in late April, I set the coffee down beside him and started to say goodbye when he touched my arm. Just a light touch, one hand on my sleeve. "Sit a moment," he said. I looked at my watch. I had 12 minutes before I needed to be at my desk. I sat on the low brick ledge beside his chair. He didn't say anything right away. He looked out at the street. Then he said, "The young man at your office, the one with the reddish hair." I went very still. "How do you know about him?" "I pay attention," he said simply. "People talk. They walk past and they talk on their phones, and they forget that the man in the chair is still there." He looked at me then, direct and steady. "I've heard his name a few times, heard things that didn't sit right." "What things?" "Enough to tell you to be careful. Watch what you sign your name to. Watch what gets put in front of you to initial without explanation." He paused. "And don't stay late alone with him in the building." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to thank him and walk away and chalk it up to the ramblings of an old man with too much time and a good imagination. But August didn't ramble. In 4 months of morning conversations, I had never heard him say a single unnecessary word. "August," I said, "what exactly did you hear?" "Enough," he said again. "That's all I'll say, because that's all I know for certain, and I won't tell you something I can't stand behind." He picked up his coffee. "Just watch yourself." I walked to work that morning feeling like the ground had tilted slightly under my feet. I started paying closer attention. It wasn't dramatic. No single smoking gun, nothing that would hold up in a conversation, let alone a courtroom. But once I started looking, I noticed things, invoices that came across my desk for my signature that I hadn't seen the originals for, vendor names I didn't recognize that had been in the system for years according to the files, but that no one ever seemed to actually talk to. Numbers in the reconciliation sheets that Joanne always waved through because Fletcher had already checked them. I started making copies, quietly. Nothing accusatory. I told myself I was just keeping my own records, being a careful employee. I started a folder on my home computer and another one, printed in a manila envelope in my desk drawer at home. In May, Joanne told me Fletcher was being considered for a promotion that would give him signatory authority over client escrow accounts. The announcement would come in June. That night I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, looking at what I'd gathered. It wasn't enough. It was suggestive and circumstantial, and probably amounted to nothing. But I thought about what August had said, "Watch what you sign your name to," and I thought about the fact that my name was also in those files, as assistant, as secondary reviewer, as the woman who had initialed things without always understanding them fully. I could be liable, not criminally maybe, but professionally, and at 62 with a new job and no savings cushion, professionally was close enough to criminally to keep me up at night. I called a lawyer, not a fancy one, a woman I found through a legal aid directory who had a small office above a dry cleaner and charged a sliding scale fee. She listened to me for an hour, asked careful questions, and told me that what I had might be the beginning of something, but I needed to be very careful about how I proceeded. She told me to document everything, change nothing, and under no circumstances let Fletcher know I was paying attention. And she said as I was putting my coat on to leave, "If you feel unsafe at any point, trust that feeling. Don't second guess it." I told her I would. June arrived. The promotion announcement was scheduled for the 10th. On the 8th, I stayed a few minutes late to finish a report and was nearly to the front door when I heard Fletcher on his phone in his office. The door opened just enough that his voice carried in the empty building. I didn't catch full sentences, just fragments, half a conversation, a number, a date in July, something that sounded like, by then it won't matter. The way you talk when you believe the building is empty? I walked out very quietly. On the morning of the 9th, I stopped at the library as usual. August was in his chair with a different paperback, though he lowered it when he saw my face. "You found something," he said. "I think so. I don't know if it's enough." "Have you told anyone official?" "I have a lawyer. She says I need more." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not urgency exactly, more like a decision being made. "There's something you should know about me," he said. I waited. I worked for 26 years in financial crimes investigation, federal level. He said it without ceremony, the way you'd state your former address. I retired when my wife got sick. When she passed, I didn't know what to do with myself anymore. The chair was temporary. A small pause. "It's been 3 years." I stared at him. "I know what you found matters," he said. "I know because I've seen it before, many times over, and the early signs are always the same. The shell vendors, the quiet authority creep, the trusted intermediary who never gets questioned." He folded his hands in his lap. "What you need is someone who can look at what you have and recognize it for what it is before he gets that authority in June." I didn't say anything for a long moment. The bus went by. A woman with a stroller passed on the sidewalk. "Why didn't you tell me who you were before?" I asked. "Because it wasn't relevant before," he said. "And because I've learned not to lead with credentials. People either believe what they're told or they believe what they can see." He looked at me levelly. "You saw something. That's what matters." That afternoon, during my lunch break, I called the lawyer. She had a contact, a former colleague now in the state AG's Financial Crimes Division. 2 phone calls, and 3 days later, I sat across a desk from a quiet woman named Inspector Rhodes, who listened to me with the careful attention of someone who had heard a great many stories and had learned to hear which ones were true. I gave her everything. Every copy, every date, every initialed form I didn't fully understand. I told her about the phone call I'd overheard. I told her about August, his background, what he'd noticed and heard on the street. She asked me not to change my behavior at work, not to confront Fletcher, not to copy anything else, not to discuss this with colleagues. She told me to go to work, do my job, and wait. Waiting is its own kind of courage. I learned that in the month of June. On the 22nd, I came in to find Joanne's office door closed for the first time I could remember. There were 2 people I didn't recognize in the conference room. Fletcher arrived late, which he never did, and by 10 o'clock he was gone. Escorted out, someone said, though no one seemed to know by whom or why. By afternoon, we were told there was an ongoing compliance review. By the following week, Joanne had reached out to each of us individually, and when she got to me, she said quietly, over a cup of coffee in the break room, "I think you had something to do with this." It wasn't an accusation. It was said with a kind of exhausted relief. I told her I'd just been paying attention. The investigation that followed took months. I won't pretend I understood all of it. The legal language, the precise nature of the scheme, the full scope of what Fletcher had been doing before he came to Aldercroft Partners, or what he planned to do after. What Inspector Rhodes eventually explained to me in a follow-up meeting the following spring was that he'd been systematically siphoning from client escrow accounts using a network of shell vendors, a practice he'd refined over several years at 2 previous firms where the fraud had gone undetected. The signatory authority he'd been about to receive in June would have accelerated the timeline significantly. We had caught it, she said, at a critical point. "How much would have been lost?" I asked. She paused before answering. "Significantly more than was." I nodded. I didn't ask for a number. I decided I didn't want to carry one around. What I do carry is this: the memory of that morning in late April, sitting on a cold brick ledge outside the public library with a paper cup of coffee getting cool in my hands, listening to a man I'd been giving pocket change to for 2 months tell me something that changed everything. I went back to see him after it was over. He was in his chair, same coat, different book. I sat beside him and I told him what had happened, as much as I was able to share. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the street. "You did the hard part," he said. "You started it." He shook his head. "I told you what I'd heard. You decided what to do with it." He looked at me. "That's not a small thing at any age, and it's a considerably harder thing when you're new and uncertain and have more to lose than most." I didn't argue with him. But I want to say now that it wasn't bravery. Not exactly. It was something quieter than bravery, more like the stubbornness of someone who had already lost enough and was not willing to lose her name too. I still pass the library every morning. August isn't in the chair anymore. He took a consulting position with a nonprofit that works on financial fraud prevention, which surprised me not at all once I knew who he was. He emails sometimes. Brief, clear messages, same as his conversation. Last October, on the anniversary of Harold's death, I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about the year that had passed. The $43. The bus stops in the cold, the paper coffee cups, the envelope of copies in my drawer. I thought about how kindness had been a reflex for me, dropping those few dollars every morning, not because I expected anything, not even because it felt particularly noble, just because it seemed like the right thing to do for another person who was out in the cold. I never imagined it would come back to me the way it did, not as payment, not as reward, just as truth, offered by someone who had no reason to give it except that I had treated him every morning like a person worth stopping for. That's still the part I think about most. Not the fraud, not the investigation, not even August's 26 years in federal service. Just the $2, every morning, and the fact that it turned out to matter more than I ever could have known. I think about the coin purse a lot, that small thing, keeping it in my coat pocket every morning so I'd remember to stop. I didn't do it to be remarkable. I did it because Harold always said that the smallest habits reveal the most about a person, and somewhere in the fog of that first year without him, I was still trying to be someone he'd recognize. What I've come to understand is that August didn't save me. He handed me information. I'm the one who decided what to do with it. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because it's easy to look back at a story like this and give the credit to the dramatic moment, the hand on the sleeve, the warning, the revelation that the man in the canvas chair had spent 26 years tracking financial crimes. That part is striking. But striking moments don't protect you. What protects you is what you do in the quiet days after, when there's no one watching and the choice is entirely yours. I was scared when I made those copies. I want to be honest about that. I was a 62-year-old woman in a new job, and I was gathering evidence against a confident, well-liked man in his 30s who had the trust of everyone above me. There was no guarantee anyone would believe me. There was every chance I'd be dismissed, or worse, implicated myself for the very records I was trying to question. The fear was real and rational, and I sat with it every night at that kitchen table. But I kept thinking about what my name was attached to, and I decided my name was worth defending, even if defending it cost me the job. That's not bravery the way people usually describe it. It's more like you reach a point where the cost of silence becomes higher than the cost of speaking. And once you see it that way, the path forward becomes less about courage and more about clarity. August had that clarity in a different form. He had the knowledge, the trained eye, the decades of pattern recognition, and he used it not to make himself important, but to give a neighbor a fighting chance. That's its own kind of integrity. He could have stayed silent. It wasn't his problem. He'd done his years. Instead, he paid attention. He waited until he was sure enough, and he told me the truth without overstating what he knew. That last part is harder than it sounds. Most people, when they want to help, give you more certainty than the facts warrant. August only told me what he could stand behind. I thought about what this whole thing asks of a person, not in the abstract, but specifically what it actually requires. It requires you to keep showing up with decency even when no one's tracking it, because that's what builds the kind of relationships where truth can move between people without pretense. It requires you to stay sharp, to notice what's in front of you and trust your own reading of it, even when the room is telling you everything is fine. And it requires the willingness to act on what you know, even when acting is uncomfortable, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when you're still learning the job and still grieving your husband and still figuring out who you are without the life you'd built. None of that came from a single dramatic morning. It came from $43 and a coin purse and the decision every day to stop. That's the part I'd want someone to carry with them, not the twist, not the federal investigator in the folding chair, just the stopping. The small, unremarkable, daily choice to treat another person like they're worth a moment of your time. You never know what you're building when you do that. You never know what's being built for you in return.